He continued to preach on call through that July and August. And then on Sunday, September 5th, Labor Day of '93, Gary gave his first sermon as the newly appointed pastor of our church. The son of a local farmer, Gary raised crops and livestock in the Spickard community and sold feed through much of his early life. After commuting from Trenton, Missouri for the first 4 years, Gary and his family moved to Princeton in the fall of '97. During this time, Gary began to expand a nascent carpentry and construction business. And after 2 devastating fires in the 1980s, a pastor with carpentry skills was a much-needed blessing for our church. Over the following 30 years, nearly every corner of this physical structure, inside and out, has been reappointed and remodeled, and nearly all of it is done by Gary. For many years, there was standing water in the fellowship hall of the church basement. Elder Guy Earl Everett presented the idea of placing a drain pipe on the existing floor, backfill it with gravel, and pour concrete on top of a new floor. Also in '93, Gary cut troughs in the concrete of the kitchen to a sump pump. In '95, Gary remodeled the basement nursery, did so again in 2020 while normal services were suspended for COVID. In 1997, new double-insulated windows were replaced on the first and second floor classrooms, also by Gary. In '99, Gary remodeled the kitchen and the new cabinets. We could do it now that there was no standing water in the kitchen anymore.
Didn't have to wear rubber boots anymore.
No. At the time, the nursery was doubled in size, and for the new millennium, the sanctuary was completely remodeled and the new carpet laid down. And membership fixed cracks and retextured the walls and painted the sanctuary. A lot of volunteers were present that day to move pews and scaffolding. Elder Mike Homedale, a professional painter, spearheaded the effort. The following year, the church received a new roof. Exterior brick was tuck pointed. In '06, the second floor classrooms were remodeled by Gary. The same year, the new storm windows were installed to protect the stained glass windows here in the sanctuary. Near this time, Gary's wife, Sherry, began leading the bell choir in honor of Billy Traynor for Sunday service specials. In '07, Elder Dwayne Place and his wife Diane, along with Pastor Gary, and Sherry initiated the Thanksgiving meal that was open to the community. It became an annual tradition for many years, with over 125 meals enjoyed in the fellowship hall or distributed locally by members. During this time, the annual auction and soup supper was also initiated, usually held in mid-March, as church property fundraiser. For many years, on the third Saturday in September, the church hosted an Eat What You Want, Pay What You Want luncheon prior to Calamity Jane Day parades, which almost always included Gary firing up his grill or your smoker. In 2010, the fellowship hall walls and ceiling were redone. A new metal ceiling was also placed in the sanctuary that year. In 2011, Gary added the new awning to the basement entrance. The accordion doors between the sanctuary and Timothy room were also redone in 2011 by Pastor Watkins, along with the addition of the elevator, which had been the northeast stairwell. New cabinetry was installed in the communion room in 2013, also by Gary. In 2015, the bell towers were power washed, rescreened, repainted by Elder Homedale and by Gary. Although no bells are present in the towers today, digital bells were installed several years prior. In 21, Gary and Mike resealed the exterior brick walls of the church. And at the turn of the decade, the church purchased what is now referred to as the annex across the parking lot from the Freemasons, which Gary has remodeled for us almost entirely. The thousands of voluntary hours that Gary has given to our physical structure alone has been an immeasurable blessing to our congregation. But beyond carpentry, Gary has been active in our community through numerous organizations. The Princeton Ministerial Alliance initiated a local baccalaureate service for Princeton High School graduating seniors in 1999, and Pastor Watkins has been asked to be the keynote speaker for it many times. He was active and present at school functions long after Justin and Jennifer graduated from high school. He's also provided a monthly newsletter to the congregation, with a portion of it published in the local newspaper for well over a decade. And Gary still serves as a board member for the Kauffman Scholarship Fund. From 1865, when the church congregation was reorganized by Elder B.F. Lockhart after the Civil War had ended, to today, a period of 158 years, there have been exactly 50 pastors that have served the First Christian Church of Princeton, Missouri, with an average pastor tenure of just under 3 years. W.W. Bristow became the pastor of the Christian Church in 1872, and he served for 11 years, making him the longest-serving pastor until Gary, who will begin his 30th year at our church next week. For any pastor of any church in this country to stay 5 years with the same congregation is a testament to both the minister and to the church body. For one to stay 3 decades is a truly remarkable accomplishment. Gary's consistent presence has also paralleled the improved financial stability of our church. After 2 devastating fires in the early 80s and a period of interim ministers in the early 90s, our church had almost no funds and even started the Christmas cookie walk just to pay the electric bill. But the avoidance of costly construction labor and a parsonage payment and a permanent pulpit presence has allowed our church to find stable financial footing, allowing us to return thousands of dollars each year to our local schools, our food bank, and other philanthropic organizations in the community. So now the fun part. In the mid-1800s, many preachers were poor rural folk. They didn't have fancy degrees, and most never received a salary at all. So to help with a preacher's living, several times a year, the congregation would perform what they called a pounding, especially if the preacher rode the regional circuit. He wasn't home enough to care for animals or crops, to raise his own food, or to even take care of the chickens in his yard for eggs or an old cow for milk. And in those days, it was much more affordable to raise your own food than to buy it. So families of the church would surprise the preacher from time to time, show up with pounds of flour, sugar, butter, sweet corn, vegetables, fruits, firewood, blankets, or anything else that they could make themselves or they could spare. If the preacher did have animals, pounds of grain or hay might also be made available. So as a way for our congregation to acknowledge and celebrate the 30 years that you have been our pastor, we would like to share a few pounds with you. So if you haven't already brought up anything you've brought in, go ahead and bring it up here to the front row. As well, we've had a very nice meal catered in for lunch today, and hopefully everybody will be able to join us.
Thank you. It is hard. In August of 1993, the pulpit committee at the time asked if I would just go ahead and be their pastor till they could find somebody else. And I think we were all looking at a matter of weeks or maybe a couple of months. And never dawned on me, never in a million years, that I'd be here this long, first of all. But the blessing has been that I never dreamed that the church body would mean so much to me. I'm the one who's been blessed. And I'm, seeing the faces here today, and I'm sorry, every once in a while people say, do you get nervous when you get preached? And I said, no. When I see all you people, I am. Because I see faces and memories. I've watched so many of these kids that are now have kids grow up or be born and grow up. The memories just flood. I've sat with many of you or your families while you said goodbye to a loved one. I've shared the joy with you while you welcomed a new birth or had a marriage, was able to participate in. It's just, I've said for years, I've been here long enough, I've had a lot of moms and dads in this congregation, besides my own. And I've had a lot of brothers and sisters that in this congregation. And sometimes I'm not sure whether some of the kids that I watched grow up, they're as close as my own kids in ways, and I'm not sure whether they're my kids or my grandkids, but it's just been great to be family. It's just great to be family. I'm glad to have part of my family here with me today. And I'm glad that you guys all came. It's the only thing that I will warn you about and caution you about, because you said that you had a dinner waiting afterwards. You're setting a precedence that the next preacher who's been here 30 years, you're going to have to do it for them too. So just be prepared. How long I'll be here? I don't know. But until the Lord tells me to do something different, I guess you're stuck with me. Or until you tell me to do something different, you're stuck with me. So, if you would you please turn your Bible? I'm going to try and abbreviate this. There used to be a show on TV called Let's Make a Deal, and this is back in the 1970s. How many remember the 1970s? How many of you remember Monty Hall? And if you remember that show, which many of you don't, he would come into the audience and there'd be people dressed in the wildest costumes, and he would come up and he'd say, I'll give you $100 or something like that if you can present with me a bobby pin. And boy, they would dig through their purses or their bags or the pockets or whatever, and somebody would come up with one. And he would do that to start off the show, and after he had made a few people more wealthy than they was when they came in, then he said, now, those of you who have received this prize, he says, I'm going to ask if you want to trade that for what's behind door number 1 or door number 2 or door number 3. And if you remember that show at all, if you ever watched that show, you knew that behind one of those doors was a really good prize. Behind one of them might be an old goat, but you didn't know. But they would all try to make that trade and try and get just something better than what they had. A few years ago, a show came out called Let's Make a Deal with, who's the guy, the bald guy? Howie Mandel, yes. And he would have a contestant come up and they would says, now, out of all these beautiful women and all these cases, you pick one of them. And they would pick that case, they'd set it down there, and then by picking all the others one at a time or a few at a time and eliminate what was in that case. And the prices range, or the value of that case was from a penny to $1 million. And then the banker, he would call down after making so many choices and says, I will buy that case off you for so many dollars. And those of you who watched that show probably had the same emotions that I did watching it. It was kind of entertaining. It was kind of frustrating. It was kind of humorous as to the notions as to why they picked that particular number, and some of the off-the-wall figures as to why they picked that number. And then there was always a group on the side who says, you know, keep going, keep going, keep going. They had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. And you watched how many times greed caused them to end up walking away with about maybe a third or less of what they had one time been offered to sell that case and walk away. The reason I bring that up is because we all make trade-offs in our life. And we like to call them choices, because a choice sounds a little more palatable. It's kind of like, well, you know, I just chose this over that. You know, very simple. But most of the choices we make in our life are trade-offs. If I pick this, then I cannot have that. And if I cannot have that, it may have long-term effects. A lot of the choices that we make in our life today have long-term effects. But we like to call them choices so that we don't have to look that far in advance. You know, the things that we put into our bodies, for example. It seems simple enough, and it's a choice we make, but it doesn't always have the long-term good effect whenever we continue to do it. The choices we make in our spiritual life may seem simple enough, honest enough, innocent enough, and yet it starts pointing us slowly into a direction that long-term we don't want to go. And I just want to look at a couple instances today, real quick, of people who made those trade-offs and how some of them benefited greatly and maybe some of them didn't. And the first one I want to look at is in the book of Daniel. This is a story that you guys know very well, so I can go through it real quick. The king has taken over. Judah has been taken into exile. He has ordered that all the good-looking kids, boys and people that were perfect, in every way, shape, or form, ones who are intelligent, could be brought in, go through his schooling, be fed from his table, all of this for 3 years, and then they would pick out the best ones to go into his service. Daniel was one of them, also Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I want to start with verse 8. Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials, and the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink, for why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then he would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer from the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearances be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Daniel was a Jewish man, young boy. So were the other 3, and they were brought in to be taught and to be fed from the king's table. The king did not have the Jewish custom laws. So some of the foods that were going to be brought into him were not considered kosher, were not considered clean foods, especially whenever you got into the meats and things like that. So what Daniel said, he says, I would rather serve my God and be faithful to him than to indulge in all of this food that is out here. And he went one step further than I had even really recognized before. He says, just let me eat vegetables. Just vegetables. And by eating just vegetables, he didn't have to worry about the meat that was provided and where it came from or what it was done. Now, just a side note here, if you've ever eaten meatloaf, you know that you can put just about anything in that stuff. And I think he probably watched somebody make meatloaf and thought, I'm not going to risk it. That's the one thing that if I go out to eat and they have meatloaf as a special, I'll take a ham sandwich or just about anything else, but I won't take that. It's just, it's just throw it in there. Daniel says, just give me vegetables and give me water. And the guy who is in charge of him, he says, but if I do that, he says, I know how that's going to turn out. He says, you're going to look more peaked and you're going to look more ragged than all the rest of them, and it's going to cost me my head. Daniel, wanting to serve God and wanting to be faithful to God, he says, give us just 10 days. Just 10 days. And after the end of 10 days, you can examine us again, and we'll go with whatever you determine. He is putting his life on the line, his faith on the line, to be faithful to God. Now, if you read on the rest of this passage of Scripture, you see that after 10 days, that whenever he brings those guys in there who had been on that vegetable and water diet, they were fatter, they were healthier, their complexion was better, everything about them was so much better than it was before, so he let them continue. They also found out that at the end of the 3 years, after eating just vegetables and water, and I'm not a vegetarian, and I'm not going to become one, but they found out that their wisdom was 10 times better than anybody else that was in the program. God rewarded Daniel because he chose to trade the comforts of fine foods and wine for faithfulness to his God. And he was rewarded. Now then, go over to chapter 3 in Daniel. Same three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego involved. The king has made a golden image, and he's considering it basically himself in his own likeness. And he says it's whenever the music is played, everybody is supposed to bow down and worship the golden image that I have made. And if not, he will be thrown into the fiery furnace. You guys have read these stories to your kids. You have heard them in Sunday school. You've read them had them in Vacation Bible School. You know this story. This is what happens. Verse 13, abbreviated version. Then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and anger gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Brought them because they would not bow down. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you did not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you will not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire, and what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. Now listen to this. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. And I think this next verse is one of the most powerful verses in the Old Testament. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Here, these three young men made up their minds that whenever the music was played and everybody else was bowed down, that they was going to be faithful to their God. And they were not going to bow down. And so, because they were really respected and loved by the king, he gets mad because they won't follow his direction. And he says, I'm going to give you one more chance. And he says, all right, guys, he says, whenever you hear the music, you're going to bow down and you're going to worship the golden image. And if you do, everything's going to be fine. But if you do not, then you're going to be thrown into the blazing fire. And the three made up their minds, and they says, you can save your breath because you don't need to play the music. Because we're not bound down. Because our God is able to deliver us from your hand. But even if he doesn't, he's still God. He's still our God. And we're going to serve him. They was willing to trade their life for their faith. And you know how it turned out. The king got so mad he had the furnace built to 7 times the heat that it normal was. And the people, they had him bound. And the people that threw him into the furnace, because when they opened up the door for that furnace, that the heat coming out was so strong and so hot that it killed the people that were throwing them in. And the 3 went in, and the king stands back in a little bit, and he says, wasn't it just 3 that we sent in? I see 4 walking around freely in there, and the 4th one is like the Son of God. Their faith was rewarded because they were not willing to trade their faith for their life. And they stood up for it. Now then, kind of an obscure one more. Another one that you know very well. This is a story that Jesus is telling them, and you're going to know it immediately. Verse 30 out of Luke chapter 10. Jesus replied and said, a certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a certain priest was going down on the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, and he put him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the next day he took out 2 denarii, which is equal to 2 days' wages, and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I return, I will repay you. Which of the 3 of these men proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell amongst thorns? And he said to the one who showed mercy toward him, Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Here was a man who was beaten and left half dead along the side of the road, who was a Jew. Along comes a priest, a minister of God to the people, saw the man, may have thought, if he's dead, I can't touch a dead body, so I better just stay away. But just so that he would sanctify himself or clarify himself, he crossed over to the other side of the road and probably could look every direction but the direction of that guy who was hurt. Wasn't a very good priest, was he? Next guy coming down was a Levite. A Levite was a member of the priestly tribe of the Jews. Also a man who should be serving the people, who worked in the temple, whose life was dedicated to the service of God. He came, saw him, also crossed to the other side. But then a Samaritan came who the Jews did not like, and the Samaritans didn't like the Jews, and they didn't have anything in common. They had no love for each other whatsoever, shape, or form. And this guy was on a journey. In other words, he was set out to go. He was supposed to be someplace at some time. And he saw the man, and he chose to delay his journey to go help the man. And it says that he bandaged him up, he doctored him up, even put him on his own beast, which meant him walking, and he took him to an inn, spent the night taking care of him that night. The next morning he gets up and he tells the innkeeper, he says, here's 2 days' wages. What are you making today? That's how much he gave to the innkeeper. Twice. 2 days' wages. And he says, I've got to finish my journey, but you take care of him. If there's any extra expense, I will pay you when I come back through. And he went on his journey. He chose the welfare of another person over his own comfort, over his own time frame, over his own finances. He traded the well-being of this guy he didn't know, whom he wasn't supposed to like and wasn't supposed to like him, just simply because of where they came from, to help that man out. We make trades every day. We like to, like I said, we like to call them choices because it sounds easier. But we make trades every day. But a trade is involved, you have to trade something. When Jesus said you have to be born again, he didn't say you have to choose. He says you have to trade. There's a world of people in our societies today that will tell you that yes, I believe in Jesus, I chose him a long time ago. But choosing, making the decision to choose, and then actually trading your old life for the new life with Christ is two different things. The story of the rich young ruler that comes to Jesus, and he has all this money, and he has all this wealth, and he has everything that the world has to offer, and he comes to Jesus and he says, it's not enough. It's not that I need more money, but I don't have any inner peace. I don't have any guarantee of anything beyond this life. And he says, what must I do to have eternal life? What must I do to be saved? And because his money was his God, Jesus very simply says, go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor and come follow me. That was a trade he was not willing to make. And he says he went away very sad because he was very wealthy. He was not willing to trade. Make that trade. The choices that we have on a daily basis will influence the direction we head in our life based on what we're willing to trade and what we're not willing to trade. For the rich young ruler, it should have been simpler, because he wasn't finding what he was wanting where he was at, but he wasn't willing to go anyplace else. The devil wants to tempt you with choices, but not tell you the long-term effects. Look at the Garden of Eden whenever the serpent says to Eve, says, oh, but if you eat of this fruit, you're going to be smart just like God. You're going to know things just like God. And in her short-term thinking, which we're all guilty of, she says, yeah, give me that. Okay, I'll do it. I know I'm not supposed to, but okay, I'll do it. How did that turn out? Now go to the opposite end of that. Jesus, whenever he was in the garden, just before his arrest, before his scourging, before his humiliation, before his beating, before his crucifixion, he was in the garden and he was praying, Father, if there is any other way that this cup might pass from me, but if not, let me drink it. Do you realize that if Jesus in that garden that night, well, it says, you know, I'm not willing to give my life for the rest of mankind, we would have never known the difference. We wouldn't know what salvation was. We'd still be right back where the Jews were at that time, to where they thought they had to live good enough just to make pleasing to God, and then when they died, does anybody guess what happens? But probably nothing. The Gentiles would have been completely left out completely, and nobody would have been any of the wiser if Jesus says, I'm not willing to trade my life for theirs. But he was not willing to make that trade. Instead, he says, I will give my life that they might have life, that you might have life, that I might have life. I'm willing to make that trade because he saw the long-term effects. I'm going to close with this thought. When you are faced with a decision, look beyond the here and now. Try and look as far down the road as you can and where that is possibly leading to. Because if it's not in the direction you want to go, don't make that trade. God wants to lead us in a path that leads us to him. And whether we like it or not, the devil wants to lead us in any other direction he can. And the promises that he will make are false promises, short-term promises, things that may appeal to our eyes and our senses, but do not appeal to our souls. Maybe you have at one time or another accepted Christ, but you've never walked in it. Or it's just been so limited that you can't really tell the difference. Make the trade for eternal life by walking with the Lord. This morning, as we have gathered here for worship, and I thank you for being here, each and every one of you, if the Lord is speaking to your heart about any decision that you need to make, as we stand to sing the hymn of invitation, won't you respond? Shall we gather at the river, number 680?